thanks to all of you for coming this evening to hear our conversation, Ethics in Leadership, a conversation about power and privilege in public life. I'm Sandra Archibald, Dean of the Evans School of Public Affairs, and I want to welcome all of you, alumni, faculty, staff, and friends of the Evans School and the University of Washington. As the premier graduate school of public policy and management in the United States, the mission at the Daniel J. Evans School of Public Affairs is to educate the next generation of leaders in the public and the nonprofit sectors. A critical part of this mission is to help equip these future leaders with values of integrity, respect, and excellence needed for public service. This is not an easy task, nor is it one that we can accomplish at the university alone. I think you'll hear a lively debate this evening among our panelists and speaker on this topic. We are also committed to serving the community and promoting thoughtful civil public deliberation and discourse, as we plan to demonstrate tonight. The question of ethics and leadership couldn't be more critical or more timely. Today, many of you probably read in the newspaper that the Pew Research Center recently released survey data showing that roughly only 22%, 1 in 5 of Americans, say they can trust the government almost always or most of the time. While this trend has been downward for a long time, this is the lowest level at any time since pollsters began posing similar questions 2 generations ago. The well-being of our nation depends on our ability to encourage smart young people to pursue careers in public service. At the Evans School, we try never to miss an opportunity to help our students think through leadership challenges and learn to listen closely to their own moral compass and to model ethical behaviors around them. Moral failures in public officials erode confidence and trust in government. And an erosion of trust in government, in turn, threatens the very foundation of our democracy. But this is not a simple nor a new problem. Perhaps it's a problem that's been made more obvious by the age of the internet, 24/7 media, and now real-time Twitter. It's a problem that is more pressing than ever. We are not here tonight to focus on particular leadership failure. Rather, we are here to shed light on the challenges of public leadership, to explore the issues faced by public leaders and how we can improve the democratic process in the age of transparency and communication we live in. I'm going to introduce Andrew Young and the panel to you this evening, and then Mr. Young will make his comments and will be joined on stage by our illustrious panel. I am very pleased to welcome Andrew Young to the University of Washington tonight. He is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Politician, An Insider's Account of John Edwards' Pursuit of the Presidency and the Scandal That Brought Him Down. His book debuted at number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list and has been at the top of the bestseller list for a while. I think you will find his talk this evening quite enlightening. After earning a bachelor's degree at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a law degree at Wake Forest University School of Law, Andrew Young was a volunteer for John Edwards' winning campaign for the U.S. Senate. In 1999, he became Edwards' longest-serving and most trusted aide, raising more than $10 million for John Edwards' various causes, and played a key role in John Edwards' efforts to become President of the United States. Following the brief presentation by Mr. Young, we will be joined by our esteemed panel of leaders who will help us further explore the issue of leadership and public service. Professor J. Patrick Dobel joined the Evans School in 1986. His academic interests concern a wide area encompassing the intersection of politics and institution and ethics. Outside of academia, Professor Dobel has chaired the King County Ethics Board and has served as a consultant on management leadership and ethical issues to numerous public and nonprofit agencies. Daniel J. Evans ranks as one of the most distinguished leaders in the history of Washington State and in the United States. He became governor of the state of Washington in 1965, serving an unprecedented 3-term step as governor. He was recognized as one of the 10 outstanding governors in the 20th century. He also served as president of the Evergreen State College and as a United States Senator. The University of Washington named Daniel J. Evans School of Public Affairs in honor of his service as one of the most distinguished leaders in the history of our state. Last, but certainly not least, please welcome John McKay. He joined the faculty of Seattle University School of Law as a professor of practice in 2007. Mr. McKay was nominated by George W. Bush to serve as the United States Attorney for the Western District of Washington in 2000 and was confirmed by the United States Senate shortly thereafter. As U.S. Attorney, John faced a moral dilemma and made an ethical decision to resign, standing up for his principles. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Now, I am very pleased to welcome Mr. Andrew Young.
Well, thank y'all for having me. It's quite an honor to be here. We're going to talk about ethics and the difficulty in pursuing the American dream in a modern society. Things have changed, as you know, over the last 10 to 15 years radically. They've changed in politics, I believe, over the last 10 years radically. But I want to make clear that this is not a political, this is not a Republican versus Democrat. This is an apolitical discussion about what's wrong with campaign finance and what's wrong with our current election system. I particularly focus on the presidential election system, but I'm sure some of the other folks who will be talking later on will want to spread out a little bit. I noticed there were a few tabloids that came out when I was doing this speech that critiqued why a person like me, who was a right-hand man to John Edwards, a viable presidential or vice presidential candidate, and 3 times in 9 years, and helped cover up one of the biggest, what the pundits and the news magazines have called one of the biggest scandals in presidential politics in the last 10 to 15 years. My answer to that would be, if you're trying to learn how to hit a baseball, you go to somebody who knows how to hit a baseball. And being one of the key players in this, I've learned my lessons, and we're trying to move on with our life. And I freely admit, and if you've read the book, I freely admit my warts, the warts of other people involved. And when it gets time to the Q&A, I encourage y'all. I freely encourage you to ask me the tough questions about why I did the stupid things that I did. Politics, especially in presidential politics, is very much a cult-like system. It's a cross when you're working for one of these people that are one of the 4 or 5 people that can be the leader of the free world. They become almost a cross between a rock star and a Messiah-like figure. You know, you remember just a couple of weeks after Obama was elected, they were comparing him openly with Jesus Christ. And when you're in the inner circle working for these people, you come to understand, I talked to George Stephanopoulos about this at great length. You're torn between the great things that you can accomplish for the world, for society, for your state, for some of the great things that you can accomplish. And this is not just true of me and George Stephanopoulos. This is true of many of the assistants, going back through many of our greatest leaders. You're torn between the historic things that you can try to accomplish, whether it be trying to get our boys out of Iraq or trying to send a man to the moon. You're torn between those great things and the tawdry aspects that you see in these people's lives. You know, you're there for the spousal fights. You're there for trying to put the kids to bed when they don't want to go to bed. You're there, in my case, when a man who you greatly admire and love, like a big brother, cheats on his wife who's dying of cancer. But we'll get into all of that. I want to stress that the story that I have is not unique to politics, nor is it indicative of all politicians. I say that especially to Governor Evans because However, the lessons you will learn in my story are similar to what many of you face in the workplace or in your family or in your church or in your community. One of the general rules is about humanity, I believe, is that people act on what is best for them. whether it be for them and their family, for them and their children, and pursuing the American dream. People will fudge on reports on accounting. A little boy will cheat with his brother playing checkers just because, he kicked him a few minutes earlier. People do things they know are wrong because we're taught as a society to win. And this happens in the church. This happens in the U.S. Capitol. And one of the things that I learned at the very end of this is that these institutions that we build up that we completely revere, like the Capitol or cathedrals, so on and so forth, they're only as good as the individuals that we put in there. And what has happened over the last over the last 10 years, and this is something Governor Evans and I were talking about a little bit ago, and that we disagree with, but over the last 10 years, prior to 10 years ago, you had to be a vetted candidate. You had to be somebody who was an established Democratic leader or Republican leader. You had to be somebody in the military. Nowadays, in this 24-hour-a-day media cycle, where money completely dominates campaigns. I mean, think about this. Barack Obama alone raised $750 million in hard money. That doesn't include soft money, which is a whole other subject to get into. But he raised $750 million in hard money. In 2004, both candidates combined raised half of that. Soft money, which is virtually, a lot of people won't know what that is. It's unlimited donations that can be given by individuals to directly influence the outcome of a campaign. And there's very few regulations. The only regulation is, one, that there be a Chinese wall between the institution and the campaign, and second, that they can't directly say, vote for John Edwards. And people have no idea, like in the middle of this saga that we go through, I raised $3.5–4 million just for John Edwards 527. And so as we get into this, we will realize, I hope you will realize how broken our campaign finance system and our election system is. Most of the folks that have read about John Edwards and Riel and my wife and the whole thing that Ari Emanuel, the great movie agent, is trying to make into a movie now, they want to focus on the tabloid aspects, and that's understandable. But this deals much more with pulling back the curtain on what modern presidential politics is about, whether you like it or not. The book Game Change does an excellent job of it. What actually goes on behind those 30-second sound bites and those two perfect family portraits that they roll out. And in this speech, there are three primary focuses that I want y'all to focus on. First one is belief. The second one is deception, and the third one is betrayal. And I believe that these are things that are universal in almost every aspect of everyone's life. I met John Edwards in 1997. I was working for a trial lawyers organization, and I was engaged to a young pediatric nurse. And John Edwards was speaking at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And my wife wanted to go to the beach. She didn't give a hoot's benang about going to see John Edwards give a speech. And I convinced her to go, but we had to sit on the back row so we could skip out if he was boring. And we were wearing our bathing suits, and we were wearing flip-flops. And John Edwards walked in at the back of the stage, and I was sitting back about right there, and there was almost nobody there. And he put his right arm on my shoulder and looked at me like he knew me. And I had grown up the son of a very prominent minister in Durham, North Carolina. He was a minister to Duke University. And ironically, he was very active in the civil rights movement and the equal rights movement. Was a very prominent man. And his career was ended by having an affair with a woman in the congregation. But I had grown up listening to Martin Luther King Sr., Billy Graham, some very powerful people. And John Edwards got up there at 2 o'clock on this afternoon with my wife constantly nudging me saying, okay, let's go. And he gave the most powerful speech that I'd ever heard, which is a lot to be said given the people that I'd seen. And whether you like or dislike John Edwards, when he was on, he was magic. When he was off, he was awful. But that afternoon, he gave a speech where he freely talked about, everybody close your eyes. Think about what this campaign is going to be about. Think about the poor people, the kids that have to hear gunfire while they're studying for school. Think about the old ladies that have to choose between buying prescription drugs and buying pharmacies. And he literally got the audience to close their eyes, and I thought it was cheesy. But then I looked around, and this is a group of trial lawyers. It's a pretty tough crowd to impress. And by the end of it, the room had completely filled up, and it was filled with raucous applause. And people were screaming, "Don't run for the Senate, run for the president. You're the man, John," so on and so forth. And I said to my wife, "This guy's going to be president. This guy's going to be president." First time I saw him. And my wife said, of course, "Let's go to the beach." But John Edwards, I volunteered for a job, a low-level job, and quickly became his right-hand man. He and I got to be very, very close friends. We played basketball together. We took our kids to Disney. Our kids were of a young age. And he became like a big brother to me. Their family became like a surrogate family to me. And within a year, I was living in his place in Washington. When I took John Edwards to his first interview, and you think about this was in 1998. We went to a PBS station, and one of the first questions they asked him was about school vouchers. And he didn't know what a school voucher was. He was sworn in. He had just been sworn in. A year later, Al Gore picked him to be his vice presidential nominee, and then changed his mind and went with Lieberman. And I want to stress that, when he got up to Washington, he used $6.5 million of his own money to run for the Senate, and he actually decided to run for the Senate after he watched the movie American President. They had just lost a son in a car wreck. They were in mourning. He watched the movie American President. He turned around very casually and said to Elizabeth, "I think I'm going to run for the Senate and eventually run for the president." So it was a movie that led to this decision. But John Edwards came to Washington, and when I wrote the book, I really tried to write it as an arc, because the first 6 years that I worked for John Edwards, he was a true honor to work for. He came to Washington to represent the ordinary people, to be the voice of the people he grew up with. He felt like he had been blessed in life, and this was an opportunity to give back. And he truly believed in the political and the legal system. He truly did. He thought it was the equalizer between the powerful, the masses, and the individual. My favorite quote that he used to use in the early years was that having a conscience and principles is DC's celestial fire. And he truly believed as a U.S. Senator that he could work on a large scale to help real people in small personal ways. When I was looking up Senator Evans, one of the things that I saw as a quote from you, which we talked about a little bit, was that he had left because of the bickering and the protracted paralysis of the Senate. And it reminded me of how much frustration John Edwards had when he came to the Senate. They based seniority on age and on your class. And as the freshman, he was only 42 years old at this point, he was number 100 out of 100. And ironically, the first speech that he gave to the full Congress was about the impeachment of Bill Clinton and how badly he treated his wife and his family. A little ironic. But Congress really shocked him and frustrated and disappointed him. Senators spend 40% of their time fundraising, begging for money, and it's truly degrading to them. In the Senate today, 40% is the minimum that you can use for fundraising. And you just think about this. These are the people who are supposed to be reading these 3,000-page bills on health care and so on and so forth. They're spending 40% of their time begging for money. They spend another roughly 15 to 20% of their time dealing with lobbyists. And lobbyists are painted as these evil little trolls that are mean as a snake. They're actually very, very charming people with unlimited budgets, and the senators spend a great deal of time with them. And then there's also just the factor of what D.C. has become as itself. D.C. is a very intoxicating town. You're surrounded by AAA personalities, and you can't run for Senate or for Congress or for the president without being competitive. And I believe that the way that the system has evolved over the last 10 or 12 years is that we're chasing a lot of the most qualified and competent people away from wanting to run for office. And I can tell you that the man that I had fallen in love with, who was a big brother to me for 5 or 6 years in the beginning, warped into something that I didn't even recognize. And, you know, he was almost Gore's VP, and then he was a close second in 2004 to Kerry, and then of course he was Kerry's VP. And then as soon as they lost, he started plotting his strategy for running in 2008. And he and I went down to the beach because one of the criticisms of him was that, you know, and one of the criticisms I use very regularly about him now is that he was everything that you could want in a presidential candidate. Everything you could want. Charisma, intellect, photographic memory, could give a speech to end all speeches. He had everything that you could want except for a platform and ethics. And these are things that had disappeared from his early years. In his early years, he was somebody who was driven by change, driven by making a positive difference on the world. A lot of the rest of the story you already know. Almost overnight after Gore, John Edwards became a viable world leader. Partially because of the vacuum in the Democratic Party, Daschle and Gore and Kerry were weak. There was no really strong leaders in the Democratic Party. Hillary and Barack were seen as possible 2012 contenders or possible 2008 VP contenders. Edwards, who was no longer serving in the Senate, spent this time between 2004 and 2006 when we launched, traveling the world and meeting with leaders in China, meeting with leaders in Russia, meeting with leaders in the Middle East, and he worked on every weakness that he had. I mean, it was a joke. He even had a jacket that made up that said number 49 on it for 49th president. But around the world, business leaders, politicians, people treated him like the next president. And he started to do crazy things. I mean, as you know, he built a 10 million, 30,000 square foot house. He had the haircut. That's how we met, same barber. But he built this house right down from a poverty center, just a couple of miles from a poverty center at the University of North Carolina, and didn't see anything wrong with it. And he started flying around on a jet that was provided by Bunny Mellon, who's one of the, you've heard of Carnegie Mellon Banks, Mellon everything. Her father-in-law was the richest man in the world at one point. And she regularly let him use her plane. And Bunny is the most incredible patriot you can ever imagine. But she regularly let him use his plane. And because she built a large part of the National Gallery of Art, actually her husband did, they rotated paintings off this plane. Picasso's, Rembrandt's, you name it. And Edwards tried to convince her to give him this plane so that he could travel around the world doing poverty work. And then there's just the bizarre stuff. I mean, like when he announced his candidacy from the Katrina site, this poor old lady whose house had been destroyed. John Edwards stays in the Lowe's presidential suite, $1,000 a night, and then he walks down with blue jeans and rolled up sleeves and acts like he's the everyday man here to save the world. By this point in 2005, the man that I knew was gone. That's the deception part of the program. You know about his wife being diagnosed with cancer the day after he and Kerry lost. Shortly after that, he began an affair with what I would term as politely, since there's a few people listening outside this room, a slightly bizarre young woman named Rielle Hunter. And I was kind of the go-between for trying to cover this up. And while he was taping George Stephanopoulos, they found out, she called him to tell him that she was pregnant. And she refused to have an abortion because she believed that this baby was a combination of John Edwards' intellect and charisma and her New Age spiritualism, and that the baby was sent here to save the universe. We're just hoping our kids graduate from high school. So we are about 12 days out before the Iowa caucuses, and John calls me and asked me to take paternity for his child. And I walked out to my car, and there was a Time magazine that had him on the cover, calling him the dark horse, and made the argument that after what happened with Kerry and with Gore, that Democrats were not going to risk a historic candidate. There was going to be buyer's remorse. And it's easy to forget now, but in that day and age, Democrats were scared to death that Karl Rove was going to rule the world forever. I mean, they were just petrified. And very few people thought that Obama or Hillary could win Iowa. John Edwards had spent years there. And people forget that during this time of December 18th to January 1st, John Edwards went to first place in Iowa. David Plouffe, in his recent book about the election, he actually said that if John Edwards had if John Edwards had won Iowa, then Hillary Clinton would be president. So John Edwards calls us, and then he calls later on that afternoon and speaks to Rielle and to Sherry and myself, and he goes through the whole gambit. This is for all the causes that we've espoused. This is getting the boys out of Iraq. This is for universal health care. This is for prescription drugs. The whole good versus evil thing. But he closed with, Elizabeth is going to die in the next few weeks. And Elizabeth had become like a big sister to Sherry and I. And we had about 12 hours to make a decision because the National Enquirer was supposed to be coming out the next day with a special report. And as y'all know, we made the decision to do this. But at that point, we were a young couple, and we thought that we were bulletproof, and we thought that we could withstand it, and we thought that anybody who knew us would know better. We were wrong. And John Edwards went on, and by the end of January, he was out of the race. But at that point, there was a widespread belief that there was going to be a split delegation, and he didn't end his campaign; he suspended his campaign. So he could have come in. If the race had been closer, he could have come in at the end and literally picked by committing his delegates who the next president would be. And he used this time over the next several months and I should point out that as soon as we did this, his billionaire trial lawyer buddies flew us out on a private jet, put us up in every mansion you can imagine. We were living within doors of Oprah Winfrey. It was like dropping into a rabbit hole. And people ask me repeatedly, how could you think that this would work? And I say to them, it did work. We took the hit in December the 18th. Until he was caught red-handed July the 22nd, he was the leading contender to be the Vice President or the Attorney General of the United States. Absent him walking into that Beverly Hilton and being caught, he might be Vice President right now with a huge scandal going on. Presently, as y'all know, he is being investigated by the grand jury for campaign violations, which, if proven true, may send him to jail. John and his family has turned completely on our family. Elizabeth has sued me for alienation of affection, that I destroyed their marriage, or is saying she's going to do that. Rielle has filed a number of lawsuits. And it's just been and I waited 2.5 years before I wrote my book. John Edwards, 7 days before my book came out, all of a sudden had a surrogate announce that he was indeed the father of the child. And then they filed the lawsuit the day before my book came out. So it's been interesting. So, and I hope that this is what we discuss about this. What do you take from this? What do you take from just having a tawdry tale that Ari Emanuel wants to make into a movie and all this kind of stuff? How do you remove the tawdry aspects and focus on what we can learn from this? One of the things that I want to do with the rest of my life is focus on how broken the presidential system, the presidential election system is. The Iowa and New Hampshire, the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primaries, Iowa's picked 5 out of the last 7 presidential nominees. It makes no sense. It's not representative of the country at all. It's just an arcane system. And I think several of us have discussed, there are a number of models for revamping that. I saw somebody shake their head back there. I know you must be from Iowa. But there's no way that it makes sense that I would have that much influence. So revamping the archaic election laws, it's going to take an amendment to the Constitution. But there's no way that when the election system was set up that they could have predicted the type of money, $750 million for one candidate, foreign money being invested in U.S. elections. It needs to be changed, because if we don't, I guarantee you, we will elect a John Edwards. I guarantee you we will. I hope that everybody in this room, we'll set up a sheet up here for people to sign up that want to get involved in working on campaign finance reform and on revamping the election system. And I hope that y'all will read the book and learn the lessons, the painful lessons that my family learned, and ignore the tabloid aspects. Because if you think back, there's been a lot of great leaders who've done a lot of great things that had tawdry aspects to their lives. It's just now we're in a gotcha mentality of media that's not going to go away. So thank y'all very much.
Well, thank you very much. Must have been a painful conversation for you in many ways.
Yes.
And I'd like to change the tone a little bit and start with Pat Dobel. And each of our panelists is going to have 5 minutes to address the issues many of the issues that you raised in your talk.
I want to just mention a couple points about what we ask of ourselves and how that connects with what we ask of individuals who ask to be our political leaders. And I think there's a couple of values, but one that's extremely important is the notion of possessing integrity. And integrity is complicated, but it's simple. We're all complicated people, but we're trying to make sense of, hold some kind of coherence in our lives. And very few of us can do that. It's kind of a work in progress, where we're always trying to kind of revisit ourselves and make sense of and change what we're doing. And I think the simplest way of understanding if you have integrity is if a person can make and keep their promises. That's it. It's clean and simple. If you make a promise and you will have the tenacity and the commitment and the self-control to follow up on that promise, that's really the key to integrity. And notice I mentioned another kind of dimension of being ethical, and that's self-control. That is the ability we've got to actually, when you make a promise or when you have a goal, to simply commit to doing that and not betraying, not giving in to the temptations. Because there's all kinds of temptations, and it begins when you're very young. You've got something I want, I can steal it, and no one will know. And either I learn not to do that or I don't. I need a grade to get ahead in this class. I can get it by cheating or I can get it by not cheating. And there is a part of our culture. I think Andrew Pennant, that would encourage you to say winning is ultimately more important than living with yourself. And one of the great things about being a human being is that we're really capable of immense nobility, but we're also capable of immense self-deception. We're actually capable, and you've all done it. We've all done it. We've all come to that point where we've had to make a really ugly judgment, and we've done it, and we have to figure out how to live with ourselves. In my tradition, there was an act called confession, and it was a way you could actually finally come to terms with that moral tension between sometimes you end up doing something which is less than you aspire to be. So when I think about it, when I think of what I would ask of myself, what I would ask of myself if I were entering politics, and what I ask of the human beings that I would elect or work for, it's pretty simple. And that is that capacity for integrity, that capacity for self-discipline, and that ability to actually live up to what you claim you're doing. And I want to mention one thing that I think this whole story highlights, and that is part of integrity is we're all imperfect human beings. We all make mistakes. None of us are saints. If we're living in a world run by saints, we're in real trouble, believe me. And one of my fears about public life, it's also true in the private sector, but it's much less tolerant in public life. And that is this confusion of the private and the public office. This demand we place that there be some level of perfection on the people who are our public leaders. We don't make that demand anywhere else. And that pushes political leaders, and you learn this when you're starting off in your very first election for city council. Here's the perfect couple, and you present that image. No couples are perfect. Quite frankly, and I think this is a mistake that a lot of politicians make and a lot of us make, the American people have turned out to be remarkably forgiving around imperfections. The real problem emerges if you watch this story and a lot of these other stories, the Bill Clinton case, and we could go on and on and on. The real problem isn't the transgression or the mistake, it's the lies. It's the cover-up. And that's where the integrity starts to collapse. And this is what's important, I think, for all of us when we ask of ourselves and we look at ourselves. And that is, don't lie to yourself. And when these things happen, get it out. When you get that stuff out, it's a lot easier to handle. And by and large, the American public have shown a remarkable set of judgment. The media don't. The media live on this stuff. One of the things about not lying is you extract the scorpion sting of the media. You take the story away. But the first instinct, the protective instinct, is to cover it up. And once the cover-up begins, that's when you get perjury, that's when you get the money laundering, that's when you get all of the things that in fact become criminal acts as opposed to simple moral mistakes. That's where I'd start.
Dan and I were sort of laughing at your comment, Pat, that if we had saints, it'd be a different story. And Dan said, it'd be kind of boring if everybody was saints. I mean, I think part of it is our own desire to see this. If you didn't have the governor of South Carolina, running off with a mistress in South America, Bill Clinton, John Edwards, those are the most watched news stories that we have. Unfortunately, we don't spend enough time looking and talking about real change in healthcare, solving problems in immigration, a discussion in my field in national security, which are really pressing issues in our country. So we sort of as a people are interested, and I think we always have been, in the foibles of leaders. And so I think there has to be some balance, and I hope for that, and I think we can all hope to have that kind of balance. I think this kind of a presentation, just to comment on the presentation, is useful in one way, and I've got some questions about it in another way. In the first, I think it's useful to have kind of an eyewitness to what happened speak to us about it. But I question sort of the ethical content of this without hearing much of an apology from you, Mr. Young, for your involvement in this. to listen to you talk about ethics when you've testified in front of the grand jury, you clearly participated in this. I heard you say that you and your wife were a young couple. I mean, you hold a law degree and a degree from a prestigious institution. There are a lot of people who've gone to Congress and didn't end up doing the kind of stuff that you did in a conspiratorial way with John Edwards. So I like to have people come forward. I think Bud Crow's a good example, someone who's come forward who said, I did wrong, I'm sorry for it, I'm being held accountable, and now I've got something to say. I think those people have credibility. I'm not saying you don't have credibility. I'd like to hear, what your purpose is. I mean, there's a book for sale outside here. I don't know where the profits are going, but I'm a little concerned about your credibility to talk about ethics.
I think I gave more than a paragraph of a full apology owning up for each and everything I've done. And I can tell by your comments you've not read the book.
I have not.
Okay.
You're right about that.
Okay. Because in the book, tonight we're here to talk about ethics and politics and so on and so forth. We're not here to talk about my own transgressions. But in the remarks, I fully owned up to what I did wrong. And in the book, I wrote this book while my father was dying, and I wrote it with warts and all, honest as can be. I don't disagree with you that I was wrong. I don't disagree with you that I was completely wrong. But at the same point, we all make mistakes. And what I try to get across with this book is that once you make a mistake, you get up and you try to learn from your lessons and make a positive difference out of that. And that's what I'm trying to do with this. I'm trying to make a point that people like John Edwards, who are good with 30-second sound bites, who can raise money, who have powerful lobbies like them, like the trial lawyers behind them, they have the ability to run for president. And what I'm trying to do with this book and with a thing like this, I fully expect people to clap when you say something like that. But to say that I didn't apologize and don't apologize throughout the book, read the book and then say that, okay?
It's interesting. We all have pretty bright lines, I think, of what we categorize as right and wrong. It's wrong to kill, it's wrong to do certain things. When it comes to ethics, it gets a lot more complicated sometimes because you have to deal with circumstances, you have to deal with a gray area, and you have to draw your own bright line within that gray area of what constitutes your approach to an ethical life. I remember when I was governor, I visited the penitentiary and walked through part of the penitentiary with the warden, and I noticed about a dozen guys playing basketball in a very kind of surrounded by buildings, a bleak place, and they were all separated from the rest of the inmates. And I asked the warden who they were. He said, they're on death row. And I had not believed in the death penalty, but that really convinced me that as governor, I would have the last say, yes or no, on the lives of those 13 men. Regardless of what they had done, I didn't think that that was appropriate, and I said to myself, ethically, I cannot send any of those men to the electric chair at that time. Now, that's easy. That's the easy part. The hard part would be if my granddaughter was brutally murdered by someone, where do I stand at that point? And so ethics is, you can make statements, but when it comes right down to your own personal life and your own personal being, that's a much harder set of circumstances. And it doesn't apply in just things like that, but we run across little and bigger and very big kinds of ethical decisions of that sort that sometimes we can make in the abstract. And the real test of how ethical we are is when it comes down to a real decision that's along those same lines, and which side of the bright line do you come down on? Let me turn briefly to to campaigning. Not campaign in the old days. I feel like Rip Van Winkle sitting here listening to this. When I campaigned for governor and when I campaigned for the Senate, I never picked up a phone ever to ask for money, ever. It was a different, well, it was a different time and a different day. We didn't do it. We didn't have to. We raised $500,000 for each of the gubernatorial campaigns. And when I ran for the Senate, of course, it was a special campaign, and money came flooding in so fast we didn't even know how to spend it. It was coming from all over the country because it was the only race, and the Republicans had a chance to pick up one seat. So I never did any of that, but we didn't in those days. The newspapers were king. Volunteer campaigns were predominant. Doorbelling was big time. We thought we were pretty sophisticated. And at that time, we probably were in terms of campaigning. At least we were a lot more sophisticated than the campaigns of Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt, because things had changed and times had changed. And of course, today, we are in a different circumstance. We got instantaneous communication. If I have a real complaint about the instantaneous communication, which my generation has a tough time keeping up with, it is simply that too much of it is anonymous. Boy, I would rather see all the Twitters and the blogs and the comments and all of that sort of stuff with somebody's name on it, standing up for what they were yelling about. I think we would have a lot less yelling, a lot less ignorant stuff that comes out, because nobody would want to be admitting to it. I've said before, and I think it's really true now, purveyors of information are a heck of a lot more sophisticated than those of us who receive information. And just think about that. We have a hard time keeping up with the smarts of those who are sending the information out. It's probably always been that way, but it's a heck of a lot more important now because it's so instantaneous. Andrew says the presidential system is broken. I don't know that it's broken. It's changed. It's different. It's a lot more difficult. It's a whale lot more expensive. And we've got to understand, where the money is being spent and how it's being spent. But I think to translate that into the candidates being broken and everybody being guilty of deception and everybody being of a mind, I think is way overstating the case. I did read your book from cover to cover. It's a heck of a read. I couldn't put it down, but I made a lot of notes. And I only read one of them. Big-time politicians don't think much about what they will do when they get to the top of the mountain until they arrive. Until then, it's all about the climb. I don't think that's true at all. It may be for some candidates, and maybe for John Edwards, but I don't think it's true for an awful lot of candidates who run with programs, with ideas, and with ideals, and they don't try to deceive anybody. They're up front with what they believe and what their programs are and how they would like to accomplish something in office. And I don't think they deserve the attributes of deception and that sort of thing. They have to, some things may be more politic to say than otherwise, but to translate that into broadly based deception, I don't think that applies or did apply to Barack Obama. I don't think it applied to Hillary Clinton. I don't think it applied even to John McCain. It's, you work for a big-time charlatan, as it turned out. It wasn't even a close race after reading that book. And so So I just don't agree with you that things are as broken as you believe, especially in terms of candidates or people or individuals. There's still a lot of ethics out there.
Well, here's a question from one of our students. I was a philosophy undergraduate and am now an MPA student at the Evans School, focusing on ethics and public policy. What advice do you have for an academic soon to turn professional like me? What obstacles do I face? And you can put this with it. What are the early warning signs of an ethical compromise? And where do personal and professional ethics intersect?
Sure, I'd be glad to
Good job.
take a shot. I teach law at Seattle University Law School, and I one time talking to a student about how the torture memos could have been written, and my student replied, well, I haven't taken the law school course called Professional Responsibility yet, and I interrupted her and I said, you learn nothing in that course that's going to help you. I mean, the rules for lawyers say don't sleep with your clients and don't steal from their trust accounts, and then many of them do anyway. That's not where you're going to learn it. You learn it from your parents. You learn it from the people who teach you how to make the right kinds of decisions. There's no rule that says you shouldn't write a memo that allows the United States of America to torture people. And I think for those who are studying here, it is important to learn and to be in a type of laboratory that stretches your thinking about ethics and where you hear about bad examples of leadership, but you happen to be, as I am, sitting next to a really good example of leadership and ethics, and someone who's inspired me from my first days working in public life is Dan Evans. So, I mean, there are many great examples of wonderful people. I worked for Joel Pritchard when he was a congressman, and these are people who inspired me. We've got some bad actors out there, but I don't think the system is corrupt. And so for whoever that student is, I would say, get into the game. Be the person who acts with integrity. Be the person who makes the hard decision instead of doing the easy thing and taking the money or taking the acclaim, but do the hard thing. And it comes to everybody at some point in your life, whether you are in public life or not, to do the right thing versus the wrong thing. So stretch yourself, study that, and then go out and do it.
I would be a little more cautionary. Very seldom do you have bright lines. Am I torturing? Am I not? I'm a member of a small group of people. We're doing our duty, and suddenly we're ordered to strip someone and put them in front of us and start taking pictures of it, and my whole unit's doing it, and we're all doing it. The guys around you are doing it. It doesn't seem abnormal. Your loyalties are vested in this group of people. Your senior officers are telling you to do this. And I don't think most of us set out to choose to be unethical. I think what tends to happen, and this is where you have to really be alert, you end up making smaller decisions, and those smaller decisions start to accumulate. You become who you are over time. And what's interesting is I think one of the most important indicators for that stuff is your body tells you right away. Right away, the mirror tells you in the morning. You get up and you're starting to get sick going to work. There are things your friends let you know, or if you find, I can't tell my friends. There are signals that you give yourself that you can choose to ignore. One of the wonderful things about idealism is that if you are truly idealistic and you believe absolutely in your ideals, you can justify anything, even killing other human beings. I mean, quite frankly, I think ideals are wonderful, but they're incredibly dangerous. So that I think the commitment, politics is a wonderful, joyous, incredibly noble, and very hard activity. And I think you do make compromises. I mean, I wrote a book on it, and I think you make ethical compromises all the time, because quite frankly, when two principles come into conflict, you make a judgment call. Oftentimes you have to make the judgment call. It's about, I've got an issue over here I care about, an issue over here I care about. I'll give up something on this issue in order to get support on that issue. You make these complex moral trade-offs. In that question of maintaining a web of friends, maintaining a family, maintaining an awareness of what your body and what other things are signaling you are really important to do. You don't enter politics on your own. You enter politics with your friends, you enter politics with the people you're working for, and you've always got to keep asking yourself, am I being true?
One of the questions here is, the real dilemma is, as a staff person, how do you have the fortitude to say no?
There's a man I have immense admiration for. His name is George Shultz, and he was Secretary of Labor, and he was Secretary of State, an extraordinarily honorable, really effective man, and a great bureaucratic politician. And he used to say, if you want the job too much, you should not have it. In the last 2 years of his service with President Reagan, he gave Reagan his resignation and said, you can pull that out anytime you want. I think you've got to be always aware that you've got to leave that. If you've got to the point where you can't leave the job, you're lost. So I think this ability to resign or to let go is tied to the remembrance that I'm here to make a difference. I'm here to serve a purpose, and that purpose is connected to my integrity. And if you find yourself valuing your own position more than the principles you set out to serve, that's the moment.
I don't disagree with anything that any of you are saying. I don't, you or with what you're saying. But that I will say that when you get involved in a modern national presidential campaign, the issues are not that simple. And the trade-offs that you have to make for the gigantic amount of donations that you have to be, and part of what you're saying is true too. Do you fight for these causes that you believe are greater than yourself and give up a little bit of that moral fiber, or a lot of that moral fiber?
The issue about standing up is, look at the person you're working for. A good boss wants you to stand up.
Absolutely.
Right.
A good boss wants people there who are going to push them on those issues, ask the hard questions. If you're at the point where you have to ask, can I stand up?
Right.
The boss has changed, or you've changed
You're
enough
right.
that you can't do the service necessary.
Well, I think that's an awfully good place to end our conversation this evening. I thank everybody for coming, and I thank Mr. Young for giving us his perspective on a serious issue.
Honor to be here.
Thank you very much.